The Batman is the most important Batman film to me, and one of my favorite interpretations of all time. It brought out a side of Bruce Wayne that I desperately wanted people to consider for years. It actually evolved this half-a-decade-old character into something new and meaningful to a new generation. And it wasn't just written like Batman, it actually felt and looked like Batman too. Basically, I love this movie, especially for its unique characteristics. I made a whole video essay talking in detail about why this movie resonated with me so deeply and why it felt like I was heard finally as a fan. Let me list a few things I love about this movie. First of all, the noir aesthetic blew me away. That was the first thing I ever paid attention to, was the look of Batman. This is something they have gotten wrong time and time again with live-action, realistic Batman. I loved their use of natural lighting. Not everything was super lit, it was dark, there was harsh shadows, pure black in the film all the time. I love the fact that they use grainy, low depth of field and unconventional lenses to shoot the movie. It gave it this imperfection that is almost beautiful in a way that perfectly matches this character. This is an imperfect character in an imperfect city, but there's something beautiful about it at the same time. The color grading was perfect in this movie. I always loved the warmer kind of color tones of different Batman comics. Lee Bermejo does this color scheme all the time, and it's just the best color scheme for Batman. It made Gotham feel a lot more timeless, having all of these old lights and sulfur lights everywhere that gave this like orange hue to everything. The set design of this movie was amazing for similar reasons. I love that they chose to shoot a lot of the scenes in like very Victorian interiors. One of my favorite pieces of knowledge about this movie is that a lot of the city was actually built, like an actual set that they built in real life in a WB lot. It was insane. They kind of stitched it together to not look connected, but Catwoman's apartment, Riddler's apartment, the Iceberg Lounge, parts of the monorail are all in this kind of contained set. I love that tangibility, and I think the next thing I want to go into is kind of something you might think is the opposite of what I'm saying, but the VFX work in this movie was also incredible because it was invisible. People love to hate on CGI and VFX, especially due to the way Marvel does it. This film, it feels like the VFX artists, they made smart choices about what was going to be VFX and what was going to be practical and what was going to be a mixture of it, and a lot of the time it was a mixture of it, like the rain in the highway scene was VFX. VFX is incredible. It's been here since the beginning of film. VFX sold this movie. It would not be the same without VFX, and they just did an incredible job of making it almost completely invisible, aside from the wingsuit scene, which I will get to later. The next thing I want to talk about is the music. The music was really, really good. There is an issue with the music I will bring up later, but I love the music in this film. It matched the aesthetic perfectly. But I think the biggest reason that I love this movie is because of the way that Bruce Wayne and Batman were written. I don't want to go into too much detail because this video is about the problems with this movie, but I love what they did with this character. It's something I've wanted them to do with the character, even in comics, for a long time. Batman as a concept has a lot of issues when it comes to realism, and I think a lot of people just immediately throw away the idea that we should even consider realistic concepts when writing Batman because Batman is a quote-unquote fictional person. I disagree. I think those realistic issues are a perfect writing opportunity. Those realistic issues present problems that are going to make your story more interesting. And if we just keep ignoring these problems that build up and build up over the years, we're going to end up with a character that is extremely redundant and kind of boring. I'm glad that this Batman actually changed the character in a really good way, I think, because it brings out a moral lesson that I think Batman readers and people in general should consider. As you may have heard before, the biggest fans of something are often its biggest critics. I really needed to clarify that I love this movie before people assume I hate it, like the people thought I hated Arkham Asylum for some reason. As much as I love this movie, it's not perfect, not even close. After 2 years after the hype, we are able to look at this film as it truly is. Some of the issues I bring up will be one levied before, some you've probably seen in other reviews, but there's also going to be a few you've probably never heard of yet. The biggest problem with this film has to be its primary antagonist, which I will save towards the end of the video. My goal here is to put my thoughts out into the public sphere, hopefully adding on to the existing criticisms Matt Reeves and crew could learn to apply to the sequel. And a lot of these issues could be forgivable depending on what the second movie ends up doing. Will they continue on improving the aspects that they did so great in this movie, or are they going to backpedal on them? The first issue you've probably heard before. It's probably the biggest criticism of this movie. You're going to find this criticism in pretty much every critic review of this movie. The pacing and the length. This movie is too long, just like many movies are too long. I think Dune 2, as much as I love Dune, it's too long. A lot of these things can be compressed, and I think you need enough variety in what's going on to make up for the length of a movie. There's a long stretch in the middle of this film that just drags on for way too long, and I feel like the music really doesn't help with that, because even though the music is incredible and I love it, that main theme and a select few instruments are repeated so often that it starts to make you tired of it. Like, the Batman theme is great, the main theme, but it does not need to be played this many times during the movie. And it's also weird because even though the movie is really, really long and drawn out, and there's a ton of time to really know these characters, some characters are just kind of left out. I think Jim Gordon didn't have enough characterization, and especially Alfred. Like, we never see Alfred that much in this movie, which is so odd. It's such a missed opportunity, especially considering what my favorite element of the movie is, which is Bruce Wayne's character. Alfred is extremely important to that story, and we barely see him at all. The next problem that I'm not sure if people hold this belief, but I feel like there's a lot of contrived romance in this movie. I cannot really believe that Selina Kyle would just trust Batman so easily and just quickly. I mean, Batman kind of seems like a weirdo. I think he's purposely characterized to kind of be a weirdo loner. Like, I wouldn't trust this guy. But Catwoman seems to look at a lot of people in the city and a lot of the problems in the city that could easily be levied against Batman, but seemingly doesn't do that, and instead seems to latch onto the idea that they're both vigilantes, so they must be similar somehow. Even though Batman is fighting criminals and she is trying to basically get by, she's stealing to get by. It's just one of those romances that don't feel earned. It feels like Batman didn't really do anything. He never made a move. She just sort of likes him somehow. I don't really get it. I love Catwoman. I'm fine with them having a romance, but in this movie that's otherwise really realistic and has all of these really nice tie-in elements from the real world and meaningful moral situations, we then get to the romance part and it's just kind of very rushed and not realistic at all. Okay, now this is where we get to one of my biggest criticisms of this movie. This is probably my biggest criticism of the movie, other than the main villain. It is the realism problem. I'm sure a lot of people are going to disagree with me on this, and that's fine, but this is something I've had an issue with for a long time. For some reason, and this especially happens when it comes to filmmakers, I don't know why, but there is this obsession that things need to be extremely realistic all the time. We've already had an extremely realistic Batman. The Dark Knight, it was striving to be the most realistic version of Batman ever created. So when Matt Reeves comes in and in interviews and stuff with this philosophy of the movie, starts talking about how he wanted to make the movie super realistic and grounded, it's disappointing because it's like, we've already seen that. The realistic elements of Batman that truly matter to me are in the writing. Do the consequences of a real-world Batman kind of make sense in the story? Are the characters realistic in the way that they approach situations? Like I said, said, the romance wasn't realistic. Are the morals of the story realistic? Is there something to take from the movie other than it just being entertaining? Does it feel like the philosophical elements discussed and argued in the movie have some kind of real weight to them? I mean, there are animated movies and comics that have very bizarre, fantastical characters and visuals, and Gotham is this completely unrealistic nightmare. But the narrative takeaways and the kind of inspirations that they're pulling from, they feel real, they feel meaningful. Matt Reeves and the crew of this movie felt that they needed to make him realistic again. And there's many parts of this movie that I like. I like that the Batsuit is pretty realistic. I like that the Batmobile is not super stylized, because why would he put bat-like wings on the Batmobile? It doesn't make any sense. So that's cool. That's great. I love that. I like that a lot of the gadgets are somewhat realistic, which that's okay, that's cool. But then there's other elements that I really don't like the wingsuit that Batman uses about like halfway through the film to escape the GCPD. This could be corrected if Batman has like a gliding cape in the next movie or something. You know, my criticism of the wingsuit would be, oh, this is year 2, you know, he doesn't have that technology yet, so that's okay. But if this really is the direction, we can't assume that this is the early version of Batman and that the technology will definitely expand into more fantastical stuff from here. We can't just assume that. Maybe this is actually what they want from Batman. They always want him to have a wingsuit because they believe that the cape is not realistic. If that is the case, I just completely disagree. There is this like documentary breaking down the behind the scenes of the movie, and they bring up the wingsuit and they talk about how it needed to feel grounded and realistic, and that they wanted the audience to feel like they're there with Batman. And I'm just like, I don't care. I don't want to feel like I'm there with Batman. It's a freaking movie. There's a lot of fantastical elements to the Batman mythos, like the city being overly gothic, that add a lot of intrigue to the world. It makes it unique, it makes it fun, it makes it interesting. Sometimes it can make it creepy or horrific. And I think that aesthetic could give a lot of energy to this movie. When you try to make your movie so realistic, especially based on Batman, at some point you're going to end up with something that's very bland and boring. I'm not here to see real life. In some ways, I'm looking for real life metaphors and maybe meaningful philosophies in the narrative, but I'm not coming to the movie to see what Batman would be like in our world right now. For example, one thing that they did amazingly was the fighting in this movie. It's not realistic. Batman could not realistically take on this many people. He could not realistically hit people this freaking hard. He could not do what he did in the finale of this movie if it was real life. But that doesn't matter. It doesn't actually break the realism of the movie. We're coming into the movie knowing this isn't real. We're gonna suspend our disbelief a little bit. What kind of breaks the immersion more than Batman punching a little bit harder than you would in real life is narrative stuff, not these visual things. The realism can be a nice touch to things. It can be great for stuff like the Batmobile. At the same time, you don't want to just override the original intent of the source material. You don't want to turn Batman into something he isn't. There's certain parts of Batman that you can make realistic and they preserve their identity, like the Batmobile, I think. But when you extend realism to every single little aspect of the character, it starts to become really boring and not really Batman anymore. Another example of them making things overly realistic has to be the Iceberg Lounge. Put an iceberg in there. Just put an iceberg in there. The budget of the Gotham TV show, it wasn't big enough to put an actual iceberg, so they put this big ice cube, but at least they tried. They at least put an ice cube in the Iceberg Lounge. This one doesn't have an iceberg. It's just called an Iceberg Lounge because there's a club under the club, and again, it's just boring. It's a warehouse club. I've seen a ton of warehouse clubs. There's a Hitman level in the new Hitman game that is just this club, concrete, steel roof club. It's not interesting. If they actually built a set with an actual, like, iceberg, obviously not real ice, but seemingly a real iceberg, similar to kind of like what they did in Arkham City, that would be such a memorable location. It would immediately be recognizable. It would give a lot of intrigue to the Penguin character as kind of the figurehead of this place that has a giant freaking iceberg in it. It's such an interesting location. It's so cool, and it doesn't need to be realistic. Obviously, this doesn't make sense. How the hell are they keeping this ice cold enough to keep its shape here? It doesn't matter. Just don't bring it up. It's not even necessarily that there is no iceberg. It's just sort of an example of this is the philosophy they're going for. I know that in the writing room, they were talking about the Iceberg Lounge, and they were just like, yeah, the iceberg, it won't work for our film. And I completely disagree. I think a giant iceberg could perfectly fit in the film if you're creative enough to know how to tie it in. The last thing I'll bring up when it comes to realism is the Joker. I know Joker isn't really officially a part of the film, other than like one of the ending scenes with Riddler and Joker, which is like one of the worst scenes in the film in my opinion. Look, they got an amazing actor for Joker, and I feel like they failed him here. Why do I need yet again another realistic, gritty interpretation of Joker? We just got that in the last one. Every time a filmmaker, director, or writer gets their hands on Joker, they seemingly come up with the same idea. Let's make Joker extremely realistic and grounded. Let's get rid of the whole Ace Chemicals, Red Hood thing. And like, of course, I don't need it to play out that way. I don't need Killing Joke to just be a movie. I don't need them to copy the comic book exactly. But it seems like every single time they're trying to make this character, who doesn't need to be realistic, super realistic for no reason. We literally have a Joker movie that's getting a sequel of a highly realistic Joker in which Batman doesn't even exist. Like, we don't need another realistic one, okay? I just don't understand. And what sucks about that scene is that Joker is written extremely well. It's probably the best live-action written version of Joker we've ever had, and that includes The Dark Knight. I'm not joking. Yet, combined with the aesthetic, it ruins the character. It ruins the narrative elements that was discussed in that scene. And it sucks. It really freaking sucks. Riddler is kind of the one exception with this movie where when I saw the trailers and I watched this for the first time, I was very in tune with it. I liked the fact that they were trying to make Riddler more realistic. But as I look back on it now, I feel like when you truly look at this character, Riddler, the actual Riddler inspiration behind the character, is the worst aspect of the character. I think more so the Zodiac Killer is a way bigger inspiration on this version of Riddler than Riddler is from the comics. So why is it Riddler at all? And to go into more detail, I think the main symbol of like why this doesn't work is that the riddles, it's the Riddler. The riddles of this movie aren't even that good. The first riddle, which was, what does a liar do when he's dead? He lies still. That was cool. That first scene and that whole investigation and, Riddler's kind of blood lettering, it's great. And the cards he leaves and stuff. This first riddle is fine. It's okay. Batman solves it immediately, and it's like, okay, this is a great introduction. But as we go on, Batman seemingly solves these riddles very quickly, and when he doesn't solve the riddle, it's not because the riddle is hard, it's because the riddle is terrible, like actually horrible. The Rata Alada riddle was like, I was cringing the first time I watched the movie from that riddle. That was so bad. Some of the later riddles have some interesting concepts. They're delving into interesting philosophies about corruption and crime and the mob and like politicians' place in Gotham City. But the riddles for them are just so obvious. It feels like the first draft. It feels like Riddler was tacked on. They just wanted a serial killer. They wanted the Zodiac Killer for the Batman, but it wasn't a Batman villain, so they had to attach Riddler to it. I'm not sure if this is a totally unique opinion. I'm probably not the first person to say this, but this shouldn't have been Riddler at all. If they were so unwilling to use a lot of the characterization that is from the comics that makes Riddler Riddler, then why make this the Riddler? I have been very upset that they sort of can't let go of the A-listers when it comes to Batman movies. They always have to be A-listers. It's always Penguin or Riddler or Bane or Joker. And I feel like Riddler, as a character, this political figure that is rising up on the internet, and it's a really cool character. The Zodiac Killer inspiration is an insanely good idea for a Batman villain. The cryptic messages and stuff he leaves behind is amazing. I love that. But I feel like it fits another Batman villain that they probably just didn't know about because they didn't do their research. This shouldn't have been Riddler. It should have been Anarky. Anarky was created by Alan Grant and Norm Breyfogle. He first appeared in Detective Comics in 1989. This character has existed for a long time, and basically he's pretty much what you'd think. He's sort of a force against the status quo. He wants to expose corruption in Gotham City. He doesn't just want to take on crime in Gotham, he wants to take on the source. He looks at the politicians who are failing the city. He looks at the economics of the city. But at the same time, even though his goals are noble and he has a very noble mission, he ends up achieving his goals in the wrong way. He uses violence, he uses destruction in a harmful way. Anarky uses any means necessary to achieve the justice he wants, but those actions end up tainting and opposing the very world he dreams of. I don't understand how they didn't think of this at all. The moral philosophy behind a lot of Anarky stories is so similar and related to the lesson of the Batman that it blows my mind how they never even thought of this character. This is an extremely underutilized character. It is a character that has, I don't think, ever shown up in live action. I think he might have shown up in the Arrow show, but it was probably horrible. This is such a underrated character, and we've been getting A-listers every single time for live-action movies. I think it would have been a great chance to finally bring a new villain to live action that no one has seen before. I feel like having that character, having Anarky, someone no one has heard of, on the big screen would have put people in seats. It would have made it more interesting. Also, having the color scheme of the movie being red fits way more with Anarky. Anarky, literally, his whole shtick is like graffiti and leaving his Anarky tags. It blows my mind how they did not think of this. This would have been the perfect character to use for this universe. But instead, they were just so obsessed with sticking to the status quo. I feel like they're still trying too hard to feel like the Dark Knight. They're trying too hard to stick to the characters that people know. I mean, even having Penguin in this movie was like, okay. I'm scared for the next movie because I want a villain we haven't seen before. I think Mr. Freeze as a villain I would be fine with because Mr. Freeze has never been done right in live action. Similar to the Riddler, but Riddler has been in the comics all the time. He's in like every other Batman comic. Mr. Freeze doesn't really show up as often, so I'd like to see him show up again. I'd like to see his origin story maybe redone, maybe reimagined, because we kind of keep seeing the same origin story from the animated series. Riddler, on the other hand, while cool, like that they recreated him in live action, a lot of the aspects that Riddler stands for aren't really seen in this character. Anarky would have just been a way better fit for this. I'm really hoping in the next film that they think more about characters we haven't seen before. I want them to think about what they can do new with the character. There's so many characters in the comics, there's so many topics in the comics that have been just left to rot. There's some characters that are even bad in the comics. Like, I keep bringing up Killer Moth. Killer Moth is a horrible character in the comics most of the time. His origin story was stupid, just like most of the villains' origin stories were stupid back then. But unlike Two-Face or Penguin or something, they never reimagined him. He never got his chance to become an actually serious Batman villain. It's not because he's goofy from conception. They were all goofy from conception. Joker was goofy from conception. It's just that they never took the time to reimagine him. So whenever filmmakers and directors look at the comics, they find these characters and they say, well, only the A-listers are worth using. The rest are worthless. So when they possibly use Clayface in this next movie, it will be extremely disappointing if they use a overly realistic interpretation of the character. Clayface as a character is interesting for his powers, and if they strip that away from him, why make him Clayface? Anyways, that's my core issues with the Batman. I would really like to know what you guys think of this. Do you think Anarky should have been the villain? Do you think there is a chance for the next movie to right a lot of these wrongs? And do you think they're going to take the series in a more realistic direction? Or do you think we'll get the more fantastical Batman that many of the fans have been asking for a long time?